Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin. We have a fantastic show for you this week. So much still going on in the world. I think just kind of vindications all around for the World War Now thesis, for the ideas that we're perpetuating on this show. Dmitry, how's your week been?
Yeah, it's been a good week. Lots of news to follow. Stories from all over the world, from Ukraine, Russia, abroad, from Africa. Again, the timeline continues. The Cold War is emerging into a hot one, and yeah, we're just following things very closely. And yeah, definitely some sad news. Mostly, there are some positive news, but yeah, there is definitely some unfortunate news coming out of Ukraine. It looks like the persecution is coming out again, so stay tuned for that. We'll probably discuss that towards the end of the episode. But yeah, to start us off, Conrad, yeah, hit us with the hard-hitting military subjects from Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah, as far as the military situation on the ground goes, the main story is still the, abject failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I'm sure people have seen the maps that show that, tens of thousands dead, months of expent Western military equipment and ammunition for what amounts to, you know, fractions of territory, not even, no major towns, even just a few villages and some fields in between them. And it shows that, I mean, there's reports now that supposedly some, Western NATO leaders had told Ukrainians that they could reach the Sea of Azov in 2 days with the forces that they had been given. So there's really there's just no victory on the horizon for any part of the front line in Ukraine. But this leads into what I think many people are starting to realize is sort of the understood truth, the kind of just the layman's wisdom about what's going to happen. Much like I would even say it became sort of layman's wisdom that Russia was going to invade in February 2022, but like I didn't believe it. I thought that it was, the West hyping it up like they had been for so many years, but turns out they actually went in. But this time, I do think that the word about the possible second partial mobilization coming in September, accompanied then by a big Russian offensive with actual notable pieces of territory taken happening in February 2024 after a few months of preparation from that mobilization. And that, I think many are saying, would likely be mostly first in the Kharkov direction and then in Donetsk. And we're seeing already this Russian push towards Kupiansk, which, again, we haven't really seen huge pushes in that direction since last summer's Ukrainian offensive that drove them out of, Izium and Kupiansk and these places. So now it seems that Russia's making it very clear that no, we're coming back. That one little success you had is not going to stay. It's not going to stay real on the map for much longer. So Kupiansk, I think, will be one of the first places kind of advanced upon in February 2024. That seems to be what's taking place, what's shaping up. And that all comes amidst the backdrop of the escalatory rhetoric in the neighborhood between Poland and Belarus. And, Poland really beefing up their military every day. They send more and more troops to the Belarusian and Ukrainian border. And I think even Shoigu made some comments about Poland recently, which he's kind of been remiss to do. So it's all heating up there. Lukashenko always coming in with the interesting commentary. He's really he's kind of just he's who you stay plugged into to see the day-to-day changes. He's always saying something. So we're going to talk about what he said. But yeah, the military situation again with the Black Sea is more of the same, even more actually. Russia's been pummeling Ukraine's port infrastructure, not just Nikolaev and Odessa, but as you said before, Rainy and all these ports all the way down right towards Romania. And yeah, like the grain deal is totally over. It's not coming back. And Russia understands that they'd see that the military situation and political situations unfolded where substantial damage can and needs to be taken against or done against, Ukrainian infrastructure at this point. And again, we know that they don't want to just level Odessa or even level the entire port, but they have no problem just destroying ships, destroying, mass docking infrastructure and things like that. And that's continuing. Ukraine has, of course, tried to fight back in the Black Sea. We see more and more videos of their unmanned naval vehicles trying to ram ships and whatnot, getting shot at by the Russian Navy. The drones against Crimea and Sebastopol and near the Kerch Bridge as well have increased. Russia's repelled a myriad of attacks at this point on them. None of the Sebastopol, 20 swarms of like 20 drones will get shot down just right off the coast where civilians are walking around. So Ukraine is definitely trying to, between that and the increased strikes on Donetsk, they still are using the terror factor as the conventional military completely fails along the front lines. So yeah, it's getting pretty interesting in the sense that we all kind of know, more so than before where eventually the Russians are going to push. The question just is, when are they going to do that partial mobilization? And again, that September date, that kind of ties into, we did say even before this kind of came out and was being widely discussed that, September 18th, that's supposedly when, Strelkov could maybe get out of detention, maybe he'd be under house arrest, he'd be able to start talking about things again. And that's, that ties into what we said, that something really might be going on before that, right around that time where, maybe people just want to be there to give him a stern talking to so he doesn't say anything rash when those things really start to go down.
Yeah, that's right. One of the unfortunate stories related to Strelkov has been just this year. Uh, Actually, for the first time, we saw a actual national Bolshevik in Russia from St. Petersburg, one of Strelkov's. I guess he was a supporter of Strelkov, and he was actually a volunteer and was a popular humanitarian aid donator, and he was bringing humanitarian aid from Russian cities into Donetsk and Lugansk for many years. And his name was Ramzan Suleimanov, so a very sort of Tatar, maybe a Muslim background for him in Russia. And so he ended up speaking out against the judge who sentenced Strelkov to several months detention, and he called him, forgive my words, he called him a contraceptive condom servant. In fact, and he was imprisoned himself for 3 months. So now Russia has really shown that, look, if you do support Strelkov, at least the judicial system in Russia said that, look, you're gonna have to be silent on this particular issue. You can't be insulting judges. You can't be insulting the government, the prosecution. And Suleimanov is spending time now in a prison outside of Moscow, actually on the outskirts. The prison's not as nice as the one Strelkov's staying at. So it is a little bit. So even former volunteers and people who have participated in the military, they're not necessarily safe from judicial action in Russia. So Judge Antonov has really lashed out at the guy who insulted him, which is very interesting. Again, but there's no news of Strelkov, of course, coming out. He's been in prison for 3 weeks. Me and Conrad emphasize this many times, but Strelkov isn't just the average military guy from the front lines. He is probably one of the most followed Orthodox Christian laymen in the world, in terms of probably second only to Putin, I would say, in terms of collective popularity, the amount of people that listen to his opinion, and he has shown himself to be a very pious Christian. So we do follow him closely. We want to see where exactly his story takes him, because he has been loyal to the cause, and most of the ideas we talk about on the show he actually would agree with, in fact. And yeah, so definitely we show our support for him, and hopefully he gets out of prison again and he's allowed to speak out. Nevertheless, the Odessa situation I find very interesting with the whole grain deal, Conrad, because on one hand, Russia is holding the EU and I guess Ukraine in sort of like a hostage situation. It's slowly, with its long-range missile strikes, bombarding the infrastructure that you mentioned, as well as the Odessa ports, and not allowing any exports to come out of Ukraine. So, which the exports, most of them go to Europe. So, in fact, in the EU soon we'll see an increased the food prices increasing, especially for things such as seed oils, which are very popular. Not saying they're healthy, but seed oils, grains, even all kinds of farming produce that is exported out of Ukraine. The prices will be skyrocketing, and this is alongside all the other recessionary inflation we've been seeing recently, right? And the rising of interest rates. So I think Europeans are going to suffer even more slowly over time, as the grain deal isn't restarted. And Turkey looks like it's kind of changing its tune on that. Erdogan, it does want to invite Putin to Ankara and kind of get into talks, but will Putin really arrive in Turkey? I mean, that's most likely not going to occur. I think he's a little bit too safe for that. He's not even going to the BRICS summit later this year, later in August, to South Africa. So it's that whole ISCC consideration that he's keeping in mind. So the whole Odessa situation, it is very similar to a hostage crisis. So Russia is holding Ukraine hostage in a way, saying that, look, the longer you don't actually accept the longer you keep sanctions on Russia, especially the SWIFT sanctions, are hitting very hard against the Russian Agricultural Bank. So Russia has this particular agricultural bank, which is 100% state-controlled. In fact, the former head of the FSB, his son, actually runs this bank almost single-handedly, Nicholas Patrushev. And this bank is essentially receives most of the subsidies that Russia that from the exports of from Russia to Ukraine, and of course from the Ukrainian Odessa ports. This agricultural bank has been disconnected from the SWIFT payment system as soon as the SMO began, and the Russian politicians as well as diplomats have been trying to get the EU to unsanction the agricultural bank, and it just hasn't happened. So I think that's one of the deals in July 2023. They mentioned that if the EU was to, of course, grant Russia this reconnection to SWIFT, it would, of course, Russia would prolong the grain deal, and it hasn't occurred. The agricultural bank is still sanctioned, and Russia's very, very much suffering under that. So I think, as you said, the grain deal will stay dead, and the longer that the grain deal stays dead, and the longer the EU, of course, holds Russia in this stalemate, the more ports and the more infrastructure will be destroyed on the Odessa end, until eventually, even if the grain deal restarts, I mean, will there be any ports left? Right? Will there be will there be any substantial exports that could even come out of Ukraine? That's the, I think, consideration long term here.
And I think from a broader World War Now perspective, thinking about our thesis on where this is all going with Turkey and stuff, once Russia does secure that Black Sea coast, then, I mean, what's the next point of contention? I mean, it's the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, right? I mean, it's Russia's actual access to the Mediterranean and then the world, the former world ocean. Like, that's where the choke point becomes, because once Russia takes Odessa, Nikolaev, Rainy down the way down towards Romania, I mean, they're the indisputable Black Sea power. So, and we know who talks about that and what the prophecies say about the straits and everything. So I think we can start to really see where this is going in a lot of ways. And I want to read Shoigu's comments that we briefly mentioned about Poland. He said, actually, Poland is planning to form a joint Polish-Ukrainian military unit, ostensibly for security, but with the ulterior motive of occupying Western Ukraine. Shoigu drew attention to the dangers associated with Poland's militarization. There are plans to create a permanent so-called Polish military formation. And that's from TASS. So Shoigu's kind of echoing what we had first heard from Lukashenko a few weeks back about wanting to protect Western Ukraine, which, again, that's not what we had been hearing at all from really anybody in the Russian leadership sphere at the beginning of the special military operation. We were seeing people like Medvedev and even Kadyrov and others sharing maps about Poland and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Romania taking parts of Western Ukraine, and Russia, taking the rest. So it seems that now with the way that Poland's relationship with Russia has escalated and how the Polish embassy has been turned basically into a U.S. base of intelligence operations, they realize you can't have, I think, a Polish force occupying any part of Ukraine. Because if that happened, that would kind of render any of the whole purpose of the special military operation being to have that buffer between NATO, that would render that slightly less useful if something like that were to occur. So it seems that is where this is going, and Poland is really being kind of pointed to as an enemy. But just after Shoigu says this, of course, Lukashenko comes back out and wants to make it clear that he still sees a path to friendship with his neighbors. As he said, neighbors are not chosen; they're given to us by God. Saying that Belarus is a nation created by God, as was Poland. That God's control of geography and political geography are these things, and I think that's a beautiful thing to say. It's just, I guess you believe in God now, Lukashenko, but he's saying all of this, and I don't know if that's to counter-signal Shoigu or if he just, there was those supposed helicopters flying over into Polish territory. Lukashenko's also talked about even weaponizing more of the migrant release that's on the Polish border, so maybe he's trying to cool things down a little bit as he sees the amount of troops increasing. And after, I think there were some certain comments from NATO and other EU officials that any movement of Wagner into anywhere else outside of Belarus, from Belarus, would be viewed as an attack by Belarus and the Russian Federation. So, maybe Lukashenko got a little spooked by the Article 5 talk, but he's always all over the place. I don't know if he's necessarily spooked, but it seems that in the midst of all of this, the Pyrrhic victory, everyone remembers the chart, that has, Russian victory being, everything everything east of the Dnieper and the Black Sea coast is like a victory, and then like the Pyrrhic victory and stuff like that. The Pyrrhic victory, I think, is no longer an option. Like, basically, Russia is going for what could be viewed in basically any circles as total victory, which is good. It's just there is always the looming threat of premature negotiations if Putin is wooed too much by certain promises, I think. So that's always what we're going to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, I think the cooling down rhetoric of Lukashenko towards Poland is very much welcomed by the Polish, who still keep to the position that, look, NATO is a defensive alliance first and foremost, which we both understand that NATO is both defensive and offensive, at least from what we've seen their expansion into Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states after the falling apart of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. So, but the Polish defense minister clearly stated that it's Russia and Belarus, as well as Wagner, their puppet mercenary private company that's destabilizing relations between Belarus and Poland. And he said that their presence, at least on the border in Poland, is why we're bringing 10,000 troops to the Polish border as a defensive countermeasure. And he's blaming, as well as Lukashenko's rhetoric, that he's saying, look, if Lukashenko and Putin didn't use such harsh rhetoric, we wouldn't need to, begin conscripting and actually enforce some of these military reforms within Poland itself and actually increase our military capacity. So again, the Polish are not taking this kind of powerful giga-chat-like position where they're claiming, look, we're trying to improve Poland. We're trying to improve its military to, be the military arm of NATO, in Europe. But no, they're mostly saying, again, it's this victim rhetoric is still continuing to dominate, where it's like, well, the Russian bullies, the Belarusian bullies are still at our border, and we need to protect ourselves. So again, it's still that defensive mindset. It's still very present in Poland, and that's kind of been the dominant factor, at least for the last 30 years, and it's not really changing. It's always that idea that the USSR has bullied Poland, and Nazi Germany bullied Poland, and the Russian Empire bullied Poland, and the Russian Federation with Wagner continued to bully the Polish. And in fact, I mean, in terms of soft power, right, Conrad, you've probably seen those Wagner advertisements being posted on the Polish border, on the fences, on the Polish side of the fences. Wagner militants are sticking stickers with QR codes, which Polish mobile phones can scan, of course, and they take you to the Wagner website, which lets you sign up into the mercenary group, and they're saying, join us. We pay better than the Polish military. It's like really funny Wagner advertisements. And of course, this is just the slight geopolitical trolling, you could say, but nevertheless, I think the Polish state is somewhat agitated, as well as, look, so Poland, you could say, is on the front line, and NATO's front line against Russia, but what's happening on the back end, right? We see France losing control of Africa. We see the UK kind of silently sitting back, not commenting on it, whatever's happening in northwestern Africa. And notice the UK, again, is in control of Nigeria still, because Nigeria was its former colony in a way, so you can almost say, like, Nigeria is Africa, still the UK's base in Africa. But nevertheless, we see Poland kind of being like, hey guys, what's happening back there? We see Germany is economically falling apart, not really, kind of being in this immigrant as well as energetic turmoil. And we see France now kind of unsure of itself, and France almost focusing more on Africa than it is on the Ukraine. And in fact, it probably doesn't bring any hopes to the fact that Macron, for whatever reason, wanted to visit the BRICS summit in August of this year in South Africa. I mean, I'm sure that doesn't make the Polish politicians feel any safer. Like the EU and NATO are somewhat united around a common goal to destroy Ukraine. It's like, well, if Macron is playing footsie with, Africans as well as Russians and the BRICS states, where's the unity there? And the UK is just silently sitting there, not commenting on anything. It's just, I think the Polish should probably reconsider their allegiance to all of these superstructures and maybe just focus on their own sovereign interests first and foremost.
Well, like we've said before, France, I think, is the key dynamic player on the continent in the realm of multipolarity, more than Italy, more than even Spain, these other places that also have some of that undercurrent due to whether it's more of a fascist or a traditionalist Christian bent in their history. They're somewhat more aligned against the current Zog system. And I think France is, even Macron in his neoliberal way has talked about, strategic independence for both France and even the European Union. But when it comes to Belarus and Poland, they're moving more and more troops to the Suwałki corridor, where they, I think even them and the Lithuanians are talking about coordinating stuff there. And in Belarus, multiple new bases on top of extreme growth of that Mogilev base. That was the first Wagner base. It's gotten huge, and there's other bases that have kind of stemmed off of it. So it's all very real there. But when it comes to what you were talking about, Niger and Africa, I want to talk about Victoria Nuland's visit. I know we were talking about that a little bit off air and kind of what that means, and just generally what's going on in the African World War, the kind of extension of World War III into Africa. There's also Sudan, Ethiopia, and everything going on there. which is big, but that's almost died down compared to what it was before. And the Sahel region is where everything's hot right now. And Dimitri, I'm okay if we want to on the show start using the Russian pronunciation of Niger. That I'll leave that decision to you. But what are your thoughts on Victoria Nuland's visit?
Well, I think Newlands, it's very interesting because she visited Niger directly and very brave. Notice how some of these globalist Democrats, these servants of the Antichrist, almost when they get called on to do a job. For example, when Anthony Blinken needs to visit a somewhat cold China, he actually does so, and he arrives straight to Beijing and he gives a very pro-Chinese speech. And Newland actually goes to Niger and she speaks very blatantly to straight up military junta of all sorts, and even directly asks them, well, can I see the former president? I know he's in detention somewhere, can I check up on his health? And they say no. So she's not really a skilled diplomat, being just I believe she's the deputy secretary of state of the United States. But Victoria Nuland, openly asks Niger if they can return to a democratic form of government, if they can somewhat have a fair election or a referendum of sorts, and they of course decline. And then she just leaves. So it's a very mysterious kind of visit in a way. And my interpretation of this, of course, you may agree, Conrad, but I think Victoria Nuland was essentially the servant of, essentially representing the United States, representing the Biden administration, arriving in Niger and telling the military junta that, look, the US is going to wash its hands off of what's happening in Northwest Africa, and they're not going to be involved. So they're going to leave Niger, the Chinese, Russian proxies, as well as whoever is against the French and the ECOWAS. They're going to leave France alone with all of these enemies in Africa, and the US is not going to be involved directly. And I think that's what Newland's visit essentially was. It was kind of like a Pontius Pilate type moment where she washed her hands and just said, look, you guys can deal with Macron and ECOWAS, and we won't be interrupting here. And I think that's probably because the Biden administration is most likely preparing for the 2024 elections. We can see that too in the rhetoric and the news appearing. The U.S. news more and more is again focusing on the elections, less and less on Ukraine, and less on these foreign conflicts. Which I think the people are somewhat tired of all these various military interventions. I don't think the Biden administration is ready for some sort of support of Macron's France and Africa. I think that's a little bit far-fetched. And it really reminds me of Anthony Blinken's visit to China as well, where he essentially seceded to all of the Chinese wishes and said, look, we're going to work with China closely. And also Taiwan is also, historically a Chinese territory. So we look forward to the People's Republic of China, of course, reuniting with Taiwan. And when Anthony Blinken did that, essentially he showed the Chinese that, look, we're not looking to fight you guys anymore. At least there won't be like a trade war or any sort of, anti-Chinese rhetoric. That's besides what Biden says openly when Biden calls Xi Jinping a dictator in his senility and his weird speeches. But, Biden's not the official leader of the U.S. There's obviously the cabinet behind him. He's simply this bizarre figurehead who has dementia, unfortunately. So he should be in a nursing home, but in fact, he's out here at least appearing on TV and giving these bizarre statements. But yeah, I think that's my take on the Nuland situation. And again, I think most folks, you do need to read a bit of history of Africa, and I needed myself to brush up on the colonial history of Africa to understand the various coalitions and the alliances that these countries have. Just their connections to the former colonial masters. So, for example, the 1884 Berlin Conference, which set out kind of divided Africa, and Russia also participated in this conference. Although Russia had 0 colonies in Africa, it kind of had to give this European oversight to this entire, debacle. The 1884 conference essentially stated that Nigeria will belong to the UK or the British Empire, and Niger will be French territory. So, in fact, you can say that Nigeria and Niger, despite them having very similar names, have very different. For hundreds of years, they've kind of belonged to 2 different power blocks in Europe, one being the French and one being the British. So we'll see if Nigeria necessarily. So France cannot necessarily automatically call Nigeria to ally itself with ECOWAS and, of course, invade Niger. They would need to receive consent from the UK. And as we know, the UK is a very mysterious power play in this whole, geopolitical affair. It's almost like the shadow player of sorts. It has almost no military presence anywhere, but it does control the banks. It has a huge lobby of Rothschilds, as well as other, has a bunch of Russian oligarchs who live there. There's the British control of world affairs is it's very much through a soft power approach, and in fact they are, I think, the somewhat silent overlords sitting behind everything influencing power around the world. So we'll see if the British wish to support France and support, tell their allies Nigeria to assist the French in Niger and essentially form an invasion. But you mentioned, Conrad, that the fact that ECOWAS has still hesitated and the fact that they've called off any sort of almost instantaneous reaction to the coup in Niger all means that, well, we're going to see a delayed reaction. And in fact, there won't be a blitzkrieg. There won't be a blitzkrieg retaking and reformulating of a democracy in the Republic of Niger. So I think at the moment, those who started the coup and that particular loyal to Russia-aligned government is somewhat safe.
No, I agree, and I think based on the reliable sources I've read, there is, behind the scenes, there is, work being done for an invasion force, but they've admitted that, kind of, throwing their hands up like, whoa, whoa, don't get crazy. It's going to take like 6 months to be real, kind of like a Russian partial mobilization moment. But yeah, ECOWAS is, multiple members have pledged not to get involved, as well as, major forces, Algeria, some of the forces in Libya, obviously, the Russia-aligned forces, Haftar. And then, of course, Mali, Burkina Faso. But in general, it seems that whoever's, making these calls behind the scenes in the military-industrial complex down there, they clearly know that, Wagner is going to be on the ground if they really go in. So that's why I think they're really balking on going in. Because, look, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, these are like 3v1 if it was really just those countries versus Nigeria. Nigeria could take it out. Like, they'd be able to win. But we know that with even just a little bit, I think, of a little bit of the white man's power in there, and the balance completely changes. And we know that, Wagner is basically one of the most powerful fighting forces on Earth today, by far some of the most experienced and well-equipped. So it's no joke when they're on the ground there. But I just want to kind of as well take a bit of a victory lap on all of this. People, of course, can go reread my article, The Africa Front, from a few months back. But even before that, before we even started World War Now, there was the World War Now Twitter thread, which, of course, these days is having its content blatantly stolen by MAGA communists like Jackson Hinkle, which, come on, man, just hit the retweet button. It's not too hard. The rest of the thread's good, too, but I just want to... People may have seen this. There's this video in Burkina Faso not too long after that coup had been, or rather the junta there had been challenged and won a challenge to its legitimacy. And there's, hundreds of Africans standing with Russian flags. I just really do wonder where they get all these Russian flags. It's so funny to me. But I said this is July 1st, 2022. I said, regarding Africa, Russia has supported multiple coups and governments opposed to French influence in former colonial West Africa. Mali is currently experiencing fighting as a pro-Russian junta remains in power, and the recent coup in Burkina Faso has their junta leaning towards Russia. And since then, Niger has experienced a similar coup, and Chad is being threatened as well. So we've been on the money here, folks. Don't doubt us. We're on the right track here. There's people that everyone else, they eventually fall into place. All these people that are posting a million times a day about Burkina Faso, they couldn't even have told you where Burkina Faso was on a map last year. But we were out here bringing you that autistic analysis, and, we're never going to stop. So I think, in general, the whole World War III thing, I said at the beginning of the show, like, look, some of these fronts are going to surprise us. And, Niger isn't where everybody thinks some things would happen, but clearly, whether it's rhetorically, geopolitically, and even militarily, this little episode is definitely advancing us along the little meter that exists in my head towards, full-blown hot World War III.
And you have to understand the geopolitical victory that Russia actually gains from participating and assisting some of these African nations against their former or current French as well as British overlords is substantial, simply because either providentially or just by accident, it seems that Russia's lack of participation in Africa has given it this, I guess, ideological or virtue signaling, I suppose, upper hand, this moral victory historically over its Western European neighbors, simply because, well, in 1884, 1885, when Tsar Alexander III sent his diplomats to the Berlin Conference, Russia all they had to do was sanction the fact that Europe was going to separate Africa into all these different parts. Germany will get a piece, Portugal, Belgium, etc. And Russia, of course, would receive no part of Africa except it would receive a partial protectorate over Ethiopia, because Russia was very interested in actually defending the Ethiopian kingdom from any sort of Italian as well as British colonial pushes from Egypt, etc. So all Russia received from the division of Africa was this light protectorate over Ethiopia. In fact, Ethiopia, I think it had like a Russian imperial embassy at most, and almost nothing else. So Russia never really participated, nor did it gain fruits from the colonialization. But today, it seems that the fact that Russia never actually invaded Africa. In fact, it will benefit it long term. And also the legacy of the USSR, if you recall, the USSR actually emphasized incredibly hard the fact that, well, decolonization was the primary goal of the Soviet Union. Decolonization of Africa was the major issue that needed to be addressed. They did so in Rhodesia, South Africa, famously. They stood up against the apartheid. A lot of these very liberal sort of policies, which in fact didn't improve those countries at all. In fact, Rhodesia and South Africa were made a lot worse due to some of these reforms pushed by the USSR. Still, in countries of Western Africa, it seems that just the fact that the Africans, all they remember is they remember this colonial history, right? Which is why today, if you're I suppose a Russian ambassador, all you have to say is, well, we Russians, we're white like Europeans, but we've never actually colonized you guys, so we can be friends today. And the Africans, I suppose, in somewhat of a simple-minded fashion, they'll just simply take that on board and agree with it. And there you have it. You have a geopolitical alliance just based on the fact that Russia never participated in African colonization. And that seems to be what Lavrov and the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is sort of banking on. I think long term that'll sort of show its benefits. And in fact, that's what Russia's doing through Wagner, through Prigozhin, who's also claiming to, he's claiming to support the Central African Republic and all these other nations. Prigozhin isn't claiming that Wagner is somehow controlling these countries. He's simply claiming, he's almost using this post-Soviet logic that, look, we're going to liberate these countries from these capitalists, and it's just a bit strange. It's not genuine, but it does have a utilitarian, pragmatic sort of benefit behind it.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties into all of that post-Soviet legacy and everything. You talked about Ethiopia. I think that, in the new Tsardom, Ethiopia, of course, this would involve the Tiwahido becoming truly Orthodox, accepting Chalcedon, which would be quite a task because there's, tens of millions of them. But Ethiopia could be to the new Tsardom what Angola almost was to the USSR. I know there was, talk of Angola joining the USSR at times, kind of I kind of think of what was it called? Was it called the Arab Union, when Egypt and Syria were the same country despite having no land border? These kind of interesting statecraft ideas I find interesting. But Ethiopia, there's a lot of similarities in many ways. If you were like a hardcore Ethiopian Orthodox nationalist, you could maybe make some kind of third, fourth Rome argument for Haile Selassie, who technically existed as a quote unquote emperor after Tsar Nicholas II died, and was also taken out by communists in a somewhat similar fashion. So there's some interesting parallels and symbolism there. But you mentioned Putin going to South Africa and all of, the Soviet legacy in South Africa. I mean, talk about, a whole state kind of falling for a Marxist, anti-white racial ideology. That's the country of South Africa. But people talk about, how Russia supports some of these parties down there that are, very anti-white. And that got stoked by this news story recently that came out about, I've mentioned this on the last episode, about how, remember in 2018, Putin talked about wanting to resettle like 15,000 Afrikaners, white South African Boer, in the Moscow region, the Tver region, other regions of Russia, for farming purposes, and so they can have a better life than where they have in their, anti-white, formerly, good country that they used to live in. But this news story came out about how Russia starting, 2023 this year, Russia building African villages, multiple new towns with 3,000 plus, Africans. And for some reason, all these news sites were using these pictures of all these Bantu as the, as I guess the Africans that were going to be there. But then you read a little bit more about it, and it's all Afrikaners. So all these people were talking about like, oh, look at this, Russia's a coal country, all this stuff like that. But in reality, it was, something that, a quote unquote white nationalist would, in theory, be very supportive of. So I was glad to see that I had said in the previous episode before that news story came out that I hoped Putin would be following through on his 2018 promises there. Someone, was it Anatoly Karlin, was crapping on me saying, oh, it's just propaganda. There is no white genocide in Russia. It's like, all right, bro. But I think in general, it's good to see. I don't think that, outside of, political language towards Africans, there's really any of this silly, Russia's going to become a third worldist, mixed race African nation. That's not, I don't think that's on the horizon anytime soon. But unless you have anything else you want to say about Africa and everything, we can kind of start talking about the church persecution. I mean, there's even some church comments about Africa as the whole African exarchate thing becomes, kind of continues to leech on as the EP shows no interest in calming down. Frankly, they've just been inflaming the schism every week, it seems.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to mention, for those of you interested, I guess, in Afrikaners and Boers moving to Russia, and especially the Tverskaya Oblast, which is one of the heartlands of Russia. Of course, you remember great saints like Saint Michael of Tver, Saint Alexander of Tver. Tver has its own, it's almost its own council of Tverskia saints. So it's a very, very old Russian oblast, and now they're inviting the Afrikaners to build what the Russians are calling an Afro village. So the local Boers and the people who've descended from these Dutch settlers are being welcomed to Tver, and of course there's a lot of land which simply is unmanaged, and these Afrikaner farmers, of course, are skilled of land. They can probably buy equipment from Russian industrial sites and of course get things moving. It's really a positive trait, but I guess the other benefit for Orthodoxy here is that, well, these Afrikaners perhaps in South Africa itself had no access to Orthodoxy just simply because of the lack of Orthodox churches down there, and now moving to Tver has its own holy places, has its own saints, has its own monasteries. Every village has an Orthodox church in Tver. And so all of these farmers would, for the first time in their lives, now that they moved to Russia, all these white South Africans will have the chance of actually coming in touch with Orthodoxy. In fact, in a very palpable sense. They visit a local village, they visit, say, a local museum, and they'll see icons there, they'll see crosses, they'll see paintings, things like that, which speak about Orthodox Christianity. In fact, it's almost like a missionary work that Russia is doing by inviting some of these white farmers who are disenfranchised both socially and economically and being discriminated against in South Africa, inviting them to Tver and to these other oblasts around Russia. So it's actually a very good Christian project, if anything.
I agree. I'm very encouraged by it, and I think, it's sad to see a people have to flee, because look, I mean, a true Boer whose descendants go back to, the 17th century there, they've been there a lot longer than even a lot of the blacks. A lot of those came in in the decades after that initial Dutch migration. So it's the same as a true Anglo stock American having to flee the United States. So it's a real tragedy. But yeah, and then talking about the church, I mean, you probably know more about the whole African exarchate situation thing now and the whole persecution.
Yeah, like one of the primary stories that came out of the African summit, which wasn't covered a lot on Twitter as well as some of the mainstream media sites, simply because, well, Patriarch Kirill was involved, and it was a lot more interesting to see what Lavrov and President Putin would say, just simply about the overthrow of the Niger government, etc. And people were more interested in perhaps the secular side of the African summit, but what they didn't notice was the fact that Patriarch Kirill was presented with a model of a new cathedral that would be built in Uganda for, on behalf of the Russian Orthodox Church, completely funded by the Moscow Patriarchate for the people of Uganda to appreciate. And this new church model, it really, in many ways, it looks like the military cathedral that was built on the outskirts of Moscow, funded by Shoigu in late 2019 and, during the early COVID pandemic. It's a really cool looking cathedral. It obviously has some adjacent structures, almost like a monastery type structure surrounding it, as well as its own Kremlin-style construction, which I guess it would be beneficial in a country like Uganda with somewhat of an unstable military situation and occasional coups. There's a lot of banditry which occurs, so a big cathedral of sorts, a big Orthodox cathedral, would need a large fence or a large gate. So it would kind of serve a similar purpose to, say, some of the ancient monasteries you see in the Middle East, which all have huge fences, gates, as well as even military-style walls protecting them. So, in fact, this particular cathedral being built it's being built in Kampala, the capital of Uganda. It's just it's a really good sign that the Russian church is actually not just taking over what once belonged to the Patriarchate of Alexandria, as is being claimed by the Ecumenical Patriarch as well as Patriarch Theodosius, but it's actually building new things. It's actually not just taking, but it's also contributing. And you may ask, why Uganda of all places? Well, simply because Uganda was one of the original countries wherein I think it was several hundred African priests from Uganda wrote letters officially to the Moscow Patriarchate asking to be taken into a union with Moscow, and they didn't want to be a part of the Greek Church of Alexandria. So it was in fact Uganda which began this entire project of the African Exarchate of the Moscow Church. So I guess Uganda will receive this first big, large gift from Moscow, which is the funding of this large cathedral. It's a really positive trait, and possibly we'll see this in other places across Africa eventually as the Exarchate expands. And in fact, Africa itself is seen as this place where missionary work is ripe, and it needs to be expanded upon. And simply, it shouldn't just be left to the Patriarch of Alexandria to pull the heavy weight. Of course, Russia could, of course, participate now that the Russian church is the richest and it has all these resources. It can actively assist in spreading the truth of orthodoxy around. But of course, it comes kind of every time we speak about Africa, right, Conrad? We mention, of course, the Exarch Bishop Leonid and him claiming that Africa is part of the Russian world, which means, of course, Africa will participate in this big building of the Russian world, and wherein orthodoxy will be taught kind of broadly to everybody around the world as part of the Russian world project, the Orthodox Church. There is always that disgusting flavor of betrayal, which comes out of the Patriarchate of Alexandria, because you do remember the fact that the Patriarch of Alexandria did support the false Metropolitan Epiphany of Kiev, and he did support Zelensky, and he even met with Zelensky, and it brings about this it darkens the whole story. Every time we hear about Africa and how Orthodoxy is spreading, we always recall the Ukrainian schism of 2018, and in fact, that stays with us today. Unfortunately, what we heard about in Kiev was that, the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, as me and Conrad spoke about this like a few weeks ago, the fact that the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra was given by the government officially to the monks to use, essentially for free. And now they're taking it back slowly. Firstly, just this week, a couple of days ago, they took away some of the hotels which were within the Lavra itself, and they were used for pilgrims. The hotels were taken over by police officers, and they came in, they sealed all the doors, and that's probably the footage you guys saw of the police officers walking around the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, sealing up doors, putting up notices that, look, these buildings have been taken over by the state, everybody inside has to leave, etc., and, this is a light form of persecution. In fact, I guess we are seeing this level of persecution restart again. We did see a bit of a lull earlier this year from about March until now. And for whatever reason, now that the counteroffensive is failing, we see Zelensky and his government really pushing the church again internally, trying to restart persecution, because maybe they're realizing that, in fact, if Russia, there is this idea that if Russia does push for a peace treaty with Ukraine, if the peace treaty does occur, then Zelensky's government can eradicate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical one, completely wipe it off the face of the earth, or wipe it from Ukraine completely by just simply taking all of its property. If Russia's not willing to fight and to defend some of these persecuted bishops, like we saw Bishop Jonathan, finally, he was one of the first metropolitans of the canonical Ukrainian church, whose house was raided by Ukrainian federal operatives and law enforcement. They raided him. They checked all of his books. They probably found some lives of saints which didn't exactly align with the idea of a Ukrainian independent state, shall we say. Like, I'm sure you know what kind of books they may have found in his house, as well as commentary of saints, and now he's been sentenced to 5 years in prison. So an actual metropolitan of the church sentenced to 5 years, and his lawyers simply couldn't defend him in front of the corrupt prosecution and the judicial system in Ukraine. So again, persecution is active, and it seems like the Russian government The church has already admitted that persecution is going on at the last hierarchical council in Moscow. Why hasn't the Russian government been using this particular persecution as an impetus, like as for example Saint Constantine used in his some of his civil wars? He just said, look, we're defending orthodoxy around the entire empire. We all need to be united by this idea of no persecution of Christians anymore. He was in many ways inflamed by this idea. He kind of took it on board, and I suppose Putin's government can do the same. They can also say, look, we're fighting the SMO not purely for these vague ideas of denazification or demilitarization or creating a buffer state between Russia and NATO, but in fact, we're fighting to end persecution, to end, I guess, the bullying of the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine. But that particular message just hasn't been utilized by the Russian secular elites, and that's, well, I guess, one of the big mysteries that we're still asking questions about 1.5 years later.
Yeah, we talk even in detail more about, that question and why some of those things may not be at the forefront in some of our episodes of Ether Hour. But yeah, the persecutions, they continue to just, the pedal continues to be pushed down, and the speed, is more and more, the speed continues, and the Ecumenical Patriarch is offering no assistance. Metropolitan Emmanuel of Chalcedon, one of the most, I think, least orthodox in his behavior bishops of the Fanar, visited Zelensky recently, just openly giving more and more legitimacy to the persecution, as, masked soldiers are locking people and Orthodox Christians inside rooms within monasteries, and, all sorts of terrible, really just terrible things that, everyone is seeing for all the world, as Elon Musk has kind of uncensored Twitter, tens of thousands, if not millions of people are seeing these images at this point. And there's really a lot of Christians in America that are realizing that, dang, this is everything I heard about, I guess, religion overseas that my country supports is just a total lie. And, eventually maybe that starts to filter down into even what they heard about supposed, Wahhabist Islam, maybe who is even behind something like 9/11. I'm starting to get, off track here, but not just in Ukraine is, the Orthodox world facing, some tragedy. Also, Metropolitan Daniel of Tokyo, he reposed. He was, 84 years old. So it's, I'm sure he lived a long, fruitful life. But, he was the head of the autonomous Japanese Orthodox Church, and he, they're looking for their replacement now. And as far as with his age and his status, I've heard, Dimitri, that he was technically considered like the second most senior bishop in the Russian Orthodox Church. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was, in terms of by age and by seniority. He has been a bishop for many, many years, in fact. And he's held the position. In fact, he was almost elected patriarch. There was a popular vote online in 2009. This is still, I guess, early internet when Patriarch Kirill was elected, and there was a popular vote that they said, let's elect Metropolitan Daniel of Tokyo to the position of patriarch. But, his candidacy, of course, was considered, but he didn't get that much appreciation in the council of 2009, of course. Well, simply because Tokyo is so far away. And in fact, how beneficial would it be for him to be patriarch? In fact, he served so well in Japan, and actually increasing just the awareness of the Japanese people to orthodoxy, promoting orthodoxy. Orthodoxy in Japan is thriving in many ways, unlike, for example, in countries such as China, where it's still kind of only taking off its training wheels. In fact, there are, of course, challenges to orthodoxy in Japan, which need to be considered by the next Metropolitan, and memory eternal to Metropolitan Daniel. But the church in Japan there's not a single monastery actually set up in Japan, not for nuns, not for women nor men. So that's still one of the challenges, and it does bring to question as to who will be elected the next Metropolitan of Tokyo. Would it be a monk who's maybe living in Kyoto or Osaka or somewhere in Tokyo? Maybe because there are Japanese monks there, but they don't live in monasteries. They live near churches and somewhat in the world. Or would it be a bishop from Russia, perhaps a Japanese bishop somewhere who's training or just graduated seminary, maybe somebody young, somebody with, somebody in their late 30s or early 40s perhaps? It's still a bit of a mystery. Or maybe just one of the local Japanese bishops will be promoted to that seat of authority once held by Saint Nicholas of Japan. Nevertheless, I think Metropolitan Daniel, of good memory, I happened to see him in person on one occasion and meet him, and that was a huge blessing. He really didn't look his age. he almost like, when people describe Saint John of Shanghai, how he like almost floated around the church, like moved seamlessly. Some hierarchs, you see them, and due to old age, they move very slowly around the altar, around the church, and they struggle. Sometimes even altar boys need to support them, or subdeacons, things of that nature. But him, in fact, he moved very freely and easily. He didn't look 84 or 85, whatever his age was, and we wish. We of course pray for the soul of the former hierarch of the land of the rising sun, and hopefully they receive a new great leader who could lead their church into, I suppose, the next stage of its development.
It's that Japanese diet, that raw fish and the and rice and seaweed and whatnot. It really, I've heard it's good for you. Right behind the Mediterranean diet in the vitality. I don't know about vitality, but in the longevity function. But as far as hierarchs go, Metropolitan Saba here of the Antiochians in America is continuing to, please everybody. He's made it clear that there will be, the growth of Antiochian monasteries and whatnot, and he's coming out hard against scientism. So we're very pleased here. I think we're seeing good things in the church. We're seeing, the growth of multiple monasteries in the Russian church and the Greek church now, hopefully in the Antiochians and the Serbian church as well. About in Montana, hopefully there will be an English language Athonite monastery under the Serbian Orthodox Church. That's, as far as American pan-Orthodoxy goes, that's about as pan-Orthodox as I think we can get. So I'm looking forward to all of that. I want to tell people about my Ether Hour episode this weekend. I called it 13.5. It's still a great full episode. Everyone should listen to it. I want to set the stage a little bit. Dimitri, if I'm not mistaken, are the Russians trying to send something to the moon again?
Well, there is a moon mission of sorts that's been launched recently. Of course, the Russians are, of course, very proud. This is the first lunar mission in more than 50 years, and essentially, this particular rocket that flew up, I guess, into the atmosphere recently is set to is set to go around the moon in a few weeks' time. Of course, it takes apparently a long time to reach the moon, and it's somewhat interesting to see the post-Soviet Russian Federation actually participate in any moon missions, because Kazakhstan was their formal, I guess, lunar, or their not even lunar, but any sort of space bases that the USSR had were stationed in Kazakhstan, and now Kazakhstan is no longer a part of Russia, is not really formally united. So, yeah, we will see this kind of project expand itself, and of course, by the time it reaches the moon on August the 23rd, I guess officially we'll have some sort of footage from it. It's not really said to, of course, land on the moon or anything of the sort. So those of you thinking that Russia's sending astronauts to the moon or people are going to walk the moon again, that's not happening. So the Russians allegedly don't have the technology in order to land people on the moon yet. It's only been 60 years, and apparently the Americans somehow did all those decades ago, funny enough, but the Russians are simply flying around the moon, taking photographs and returning back. And, there is this sort of consideration of, based on your recent A4 Hour episode, as well, we didn't really see this kind of, this wasn't really an advertised mission, and in fact, could this be just Russian propaganda, for example, trying to raise the prestige amongst all this economic and geopolitical turmoil, just raising the prestige of the Russian Federation, showing that, look, it's still capable of actually taking some of these extra-orbital missions into outer space, and the Russian Federation is actually doing fine and great domestically, that it can afford to do something like this, afford to actually run its own spaceports and, things of that nature. I think it does bring a whole space debate into consideration, because NASA has been responsible for probably one of the largest increases in atheism in the United States. Like, I watched your episode with Anthony a few days ago. Just listening to it, you could really tell that, well, the whole obsession with space, at least though in the previous century, has been associated with atheism, with scientism, and denial of Genesis, a denial of God's creation of the universe, and just this, it's almost like an ideological obsession in a way. And I'm not sure if Russia's falling victim to that, but they are seeming to use it for purposes of propaganda.
Well, we've discussed in some of our Ether Hours about the Russian deep state and the Russian elite. I think we've discussed one of the top people who is the head of Roscosmos and kind of where his background came from, and maybe you can tap us in fill me in again on the details. I'm forgetting his name, Dimitri, but yeah, everyone should definitely check out. It'll be linked below. Ether Hour 13.5 Space is Fake. It's a re-upload of my interview with Anthony of Westgate on his podcast that is no longer ongoing, The Reversion, and we discuss, cosmology, geocentrism, heliocentrism, flat Earth. We go into all of it. Gets pretty spicy and based. So be sure to check that out. I've heard nothing but good things from it. And I've gotten, if people disagree, there's nothing. Just respectfully comment. I won't take kindly to people, spurging out in the comments. So, but if you respectfully disagree, I love engaging with people about this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think as far as what we're going to get from this, maybe I'll analyze some of the potential CGI images. I think the Chinese are the ones that are going to be trying to put people on the moon in the somewhat near future, and I don't know if they think they've got a Stanley Kubrick that can make it look realistic enough, but yeah, I mean, people can check out some of the links in the description of the Substack post for Ether Hour 13.5. I have a lot of, video evidence on the ISS and stuff like that being obviously staged and whatnot. So it's interesting stuff. But I think in general, yeah, Russia still, it's one of their Soviet legacies was the space race. And you see all these memes from Z people. It's like, and there's some truth to it that Russia had all these other milestones in like aeronautics and kind of atmospheric kind of record breaking, and then America fakes the moon landing, and it's like, oh, they won the space race. Whereas I think there were realistic things being set with like breaking the sound barrier up at high altitudes and whatnot, but then you start getting past the quote unquote Van Allen belts, translation the firmament, and it starts to really get into this. And then, like you said, Dimitri, it's been 60 years, we don't have this technology. According to Chief Astronaut Don Pettit, we destroyed the technology and then we forgot how to do it, and then we taped over the original moon landing footage. It's like, okay, at what point do you kind of just admit the jig's up, man? Like, it's obviously you faked the moon landing for Cold War propaganda. Like, that's how it went down. And it's also now the pillar supposedly of human achievement, and you get counter-signaled by people online that are just so they're just married to this idea of scientific progress that they just can't deal with the fact that a chief tenet of Zog and kind of the modern mind virus is the stranglehold that institutional science has, and the moon landing is kind of their coup de grace. And read some of the links. I talk more about gravitational theory and ether theories and other things that also are important in deconstructing the Einsteinian post moon landing kind of perspective that we've all been indoctrinated into in the science world. But yeah, check it out. I think it's good. Maybe I'll talk more about it with some other people. I'm talking to some friends that know more about specific details about the whole cosmology debate. So let me know in the comments maybe if you want to hear more of that. But yeah, in general, if you have anything else you want to say about space, Dimitri, or the whole Roscosmos thing, lay it on me. But we have there's a few other stories I want to tap into as well.
Yeah, I think so. The previous leader, of course, of Roscosmos was this right-wing Russian Orthodox politician Dmitry Rogozin, who has since retired from that role, as you mentioned. But he's of course actively participating in the SMO at the moment, posting things on Telegram and Kontakte. Quite a vocal person. Again, he's somewhat of an interesting character himself. We speak about him on one of our Ether Hour episodes about the Russian elites. Him, of course, being a member of, I guess, the Russian right wing and becoming this participating in the Putin government, trying to reform it from the inside. He has a very interesting story. But the Luna 25 mission that's right now flying to the moon, of course, one of the goals, which is officially stated, is, of course, besides photographs, it's going to land a probe on the moon itself, and of course the probe will be somewhat remote controllable, I think. And yes, that's supposed to bring back data and things. So again, very interesting. And again, one of the, I guess, propaganda and somewhat psychological benefits of this mission, at least for Russians, at least this is how it's advertised, is, well, Russia is able to send a probe to the moon and send a rocket that flies around the moon without any Western help, because allegedly Roscosmos has done this somewhat independently. Or, China did help a little bit, but the EU, America, they didn't contribute anything to this. Whereas the Soviet missions, they somewhat used, they still had some cooperation with the United States in terms of, at least information was passed back and forth. But here, Russia seems to be completely isolated, and it's capable. Again, I don't know if this is the victory the Russian state thinks. We'd be more impressed if the Russian state, again, and maybe this is just my zealotry speaking, but we'd be more impressed if the Russian state announced, for example, some great achievement in Ukraine, for example, or some sort of move to move to actually resolve the Ukrainian war peacefully and maybe end the church persecution rather than sending a probe to the moon. I think there's more palpable achievements you could look at, or even perhaps reforming itself, reforming some of the internal oligarchic structures, which we speak about on occasion. There are just some very interesting elites within Russia itself who seemingly act completely unhinged, and they maybe reforming migration law, for example, for Central Asians. That would be a bit more palpable than sending a simple probe to the moon, or allegedly doing so. It just seems to be a big propaganda act, similar to something Elon Musk would tweet or post about, and I'm just not sure how overall effective would it be. Although, of course, entertaining for most of us. We all want to see big things get launched up into the air and big airplanes and things. So of course, the technology is incredibly impressive. It's just exactly how much effect would it have on what's happening on the ground. I think the fate of Russia is being decided right now in Ukraine in this conflict. Now that, again, the second mobilization wave is being announced, the church is being persecuted. Ukraine amounts to almost a quarter or even a third of all Russian bishops. And, it's being torn apart at the seams. I don't know how important the moon mission is at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the moon is likely a plasma. You can't really go there, but you can listen to the episode to hear more about that. But it's interesting, that guy, maybe he was based. He was the head of Roscosmos, and then he's out of power for a year and a half, 2 years, and suddenly now they're sending stuff to the moon again. Maybe he was putting a damper on some of that nonsense. Who knows? I don't know what was up. I didn't follow Roscosmos back then, so I'm just speaking out of my ass here. But I think before we give a little bit of a commentary on everything going on in the U.S. with Trump, they're really going after him. I want to mention a few stories. I mean, in South America, one of the top polling candidates for the presidency there was assassinated, and then immediately afterwards, Victoria Nuland's getting involved, and the FBI is heading the investigation. So there's some very suspicious things going on. We had talked about some of the Lula Bolsonaro stuff back in the day. We've mentioned other. South America is not the main domain of what we discussed, but World War III has, its tentacles have extended there. Of course, Brazil is the B in BRICS. It's going to be, and Lula, despite not being anywhere near as independent or quote unquote, based as Bolsonaro, he does have that old school Russian, like, kind of South American socialist ties. So he's always going to be a player in the multipolar world because Brazil is this huge country. But in Ecuador, it seems that the U.S. is kind of covering up for this sort of obvious assassination that went down there. And, Ecuador is actually one of the more stable, one of the slightly higher, quality of life countries, especially in northern South America. So, it's interesting that stuff's going on there. I've talked about what's going on there a little bit with our good friend Tristan Haggard. You might remember, Primal Edge Health, great guy. He's filled me in a few times on what's going on in Ecuador. He's living the homestead life down there in the clean and good, living with the goats and the cows and everything. So, show him some love on Twitter and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, and then you go to Asia as well. The North Korea has just been, we may have mentioned this a little bit on the last episode, but North Korea is, they've just every time they just fully continue to increase their support for the special military operation. There's reports that they've pledged to send 100,000 troops to the Donbass itself, and that's who knows how serious that really is. The North Koreans, they have the luxury of kind of being able to say things and kind of act on that as they please, but they've also been very bellicose towards South Korea. So we're seeing, again, with Niger and Sahel, with Ukraine, with stuff in the Caucasus, Syria, and then of course China, Taiwan, and now these other peripheral Asian conflicts. I mean, it is real. Like, just think about the timeline of World War II. As I said in that thread I mentioned earlier, when I was quoting myself about Africa over a year ago, one of the quotes I have in that, and this is also in my World War Now article on the Substack, is, were they calling it World War II during the Anschluss? Maybe some people were predicting that, but we're right in that stage right now. We're right before, the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Anschluss, ultimately the whole debacle in Poland, and how that all eventually leads to, Operation Barbarossa. And that's, whatever that will look like, that's what's going to be decided here in the next 5 years. Kind of what would be the quote unquote Operation Barbarossa of World War III. And maybe it won't be something like that. Maybe it'll be, three slightly smaller fronts across, an even broader spectrum of fronts, due to the increased multipolarity of, just kind of the world identity and how we've all been globalized so much that it's all, these fronts are even, the African front will be even more relevant than just, North Africa like it was in World War II. There will be, all this sub-Saharan stuff will also be playing a role. And that's what we've been seeing for the last few episodes, and we've been covering all of that. So, Dimitri, do you have any thoughts on the state of World War III?
Yeah, I think what we really haven't seen yet is, in fact, this a larger escalation in the Middle East. Because I think what's very interesting is Russia and Turkey, in fact, in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, that's probably the only place that can actually spark up and cause a real fire. But in fact, Russia and Turkey seem to agree that they prefer Azerbaijan over Armenia in many ways. So in fact, when the two big superpowers in that particular area where the Caucasus Mountains meet, agree on one particular stance, and they both support Azerbaijan for various reasons, it doesn't look like that could cause even the West doesn't seem to have the ability to intervene and really even improve Armenia's military enough to actually cause a certain proxy conflict there. And Iran is actually acting very, very wisely by supporting Russia. Notice how Iran sends its drones and technology and also other equipment, Kevlars and things like that, even basic clothing for the Russian military personnel to Russia, because it knows that, well, look, it's almost like if Iran doesn't support Russia now, the world powers, the globalists, are going to come for Iran next. They're not going to allow this conservative Muslim republic to exist for much longer than, once Russia's taken care of and once Russia is reformed and liberalized, Iran will be next on the chopping block, as Iran is one of the legendary anti-democratic villains of the world. So it does need to go. And so Iran's like, okay, we need to kind of keep this conflict in Europe rather than on our doorstep somewhere north in Azerbaijan, because Iran does have, again, we spoke about this many times, but Iran does have border considerations with Azerbaijan, which are not in fact, still a bit tense up there. So something could, of course, begin, and Azerbaijan could become this next big issue for Iran. But so they're not letting that happen. They're in fact keeping the attention of the world, of the globalists, on that Eastern European front, which is bad for us because, again, our church is being affected. Our people are being somewhat, basically, they're being victimized. Innocent people are dying, but it's a good thing from the perspective of the Middle East and, I guess, conservative powers, because they get to, again, keep the conflict far away from their doorstep. And the other big players we really haven't seen in this, Conrad, is, of course, the massive Arabic states, the big oil states, who are simply sitting back and not contributing, not really agreeing. Like we saw that Middle Eastern Peace Summit really fail and not really achieve anything. Of course, Russian representatives weren't invited to the talk, which is exactly useless. If it's going to be a mediation talk, even basic things such as mediation and conferencing at a domestic, for example, like imagine just the casual, not even casual, but just the real domestic dispute of sorts. You bring both parties to the talk. You bring both the wife and you bring the husband, right? In this case, if Russia is the husband and Ukraine's the wife, well, the husband wasn't invited to the talk. So why is this Saudi Arabia conference even taking place? It's useless. It won't achieve anything. And we also see Israel as well taking this back seat. It's almost like Israel was somewhat bloodied, or maybe used up most of its kind of fuel and ideological power during this ISIS debacle in Syria over the last decade. And in fact, Israel is really sitting back, trying to resolve itself domestically. So I think the fact that we haven't entered into like an outright hot World War III is due to the fact that the Middle East is still in this status quo frozen state that it hasn't really been engulfed in flames yet. And I'm not saying that it's bound to have. I mean, all of these contradictions in the Middle East are still unresolved, right? So they could, of course, occur in the next decade or two, or even 5 years. And then, of course, there's always that Chinese-Taiwanese conflict that will, eventually play out. Or even if it's not an actual geopolitical military conflict, there will be a diplomatic war of sorts. There will be either a joining, such as what happened with Hong Kong, or there will be, of course, the presence of Americans, and maybe the Americans and the Chinese are going to duke it out in some sort of way. But generally, I think just the expansion into Africa has really shown to our listeners, you guys, as well as me and Conrad, it's kind of proven the fact that, look, as soon as the military world conflict draws in the Africans, that's when you know it has turned into an actual world war. And Africa now is completely inflamed. Like it is just, you can obviously see there are still post-colonial states belonging to like British influence. There are still those countries again which have always belonged to the French, and of course, in terms of landmass, they're larger than the European Union. And of course, now there's coups going on, and Russia's directly involved. There's Chinese influence, and the church is involved too, of all things, right? So, again, now that Africa's here, I think we can ultimately say that yes, we are in this next post-COVID phase of the conflict. It's kind of becoming really warm, and also the distraction is gone. So no one's worried about the pandemic anymore. Nobody's worried about these artificial concerns. People are focusing, by people I mean individuals as well as countries, are really focusing on their own sovereign, on their own sovereign goals, including countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali. They're very self-interested now, and everyone's going to duke it out over various local contradictions and local objectives and goals. It's not that the whole world is fighting one another just because it's, all these countries, they're not all fighting for the same goals, but sometimes contradictions, they align in time, and this is why events such as World War One took place among seemingly all these Christian European countries, Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox countries that simply did not agree on certain things. That's just the unfortunate reality, and there are people behind the scenes. There are globalists. There are groups who shall not be named here on World War Now, which you can listen to the A4 Hour episodes or read our articles to kind of find out exactly who these people are that benefit from these conflicts, and they actually spark and light these giant fires around the world and benefit from them ultimately, because again, these people sitting in bunkers and living overseas in the UK or in New York, they don't necessarily get involved themselves. They simply control things from abroad.
When you mentioned the Middle East, and it's true the Caucasus is probably the hottest zone right now in that region, but Syria is always ongoing, and that just directly ties in Turkey, the US, Russia, Iran, and Israel kind of at all times. So I think the fact that Assad, he's been in power, that's been an ongoing conflict since 2011. It's always going to be such a key to all of this. And you mentioned China. I do agree that if China can diplomatically solve the Taiwan crisis, though, I mean, we're going to see like a rush of America's enemies just doing whatever they want from like North Korea, Iran. They'd make moves because it's like, oh wow, the U.S. is that weak. That would be a big blow to the U.S. So I do want to eventually get a China expert on to kind of talk about the situation there and everything. Maybe Steve Su. I want to talk to him. That'd be an interesting show. But yeah, I mean, besides, if you have anything else to say, we can discuss that as well. But I want to kind of get home to the home front in the U.S. Things going on with Trump, with the campaign, everything is heating up. Trump, of course, facing all of these indictments, the main one being the quote unquote J6 indictment for these conspiracy charges in DC. Man, he's getting screwed over. This judge is this Jamaican Obama appointee, and she's the only judge in the whole country that's throwing the book at these J6 defendants. She's like giving longer sentences than the prosecution is recommending in the case of some of these January 6 defendants. She's, just a total DMV lady tyrant. Like, this is just, peak idiocracy, decline of America. I could say more, but I don't want to get banned or anything. But this is just ridiculous that someone could be treated this way, and they're trying to put restrictions on basically what he can talk about regarding the case and all sorts of things like that on the campaign trail. Like, he's basically not going to be able to defend himself against whatever these people end up leaking to the media about the case and things about, supposedly his treatment of the election. And, they're just going to try to make it seem, again, none of this is, they're just trying to criminalize his statements and his beliefs about what happened in the election. It doesn't matter how quote unquote, scandalized someone is by that. How some democracy lover is scandalized by someone willing to do whatever it takes to do what's right and do what's necessary. But it doesn't matter. It's just freedom of speech. That's how these things work. But they're trying to. This is how they're coming at you. In Europe, they already killed free speech. With Holocaust denial laws, and in America, this election denial stuff is going to be what gives them that backdoor in. That, and we see in Florida's going all in with some of these anti-Semitism pamphleting laws as well. So it's all these, backwards ways to just ban free speech, and it's terrible. It's not good. Trump's approval, of course, is skyrocketing, and that's no surprise. But the question is like, at this level, like they're gonna try to find ways. Like, look, as Jim said on our show, if they Jim Jatras, of course, if they ban him from the ballot in Pennsylvania, it's over. He can't win. Like, it's not possible.
Yeah, and someone like Ron DeSantis can't just come in and save the Republican Party if Trump is unavailable to do so. And if Trump is imprisoned and he can't campaign properly in 2024. And frankly, I think his defense attorneys can draw out this trial in order for it not to, in order for him not to be imprisoned by, say, if they play it out correctly, draw it out all the way up until the election. But if Trump is imprisoned end of 2023 or early 2024 before the election actually pops off, then I'm just not sure if the Republicans could even take a Ron DeSantis and actually defeat a Bob Biden.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the crazy thing. This lady Tanya Chutkan, this clown of a judge, she's
Yeah.
talking about, yo, we're going with the principle of a speedy trial. Like she's trying to get this thing going. Like they want this guy in jail within the next like 2 or 3 months. Like it's crazy. And I think that I mean, they've also got all the Stormy Daniels crap, the stuff in Georgia, the document stuff. I mean, who knows what they're going to do with all? They're just trying to overwhelm him, of course, with lawfare. But again, this Rod, you're right. Rod, as Trump calls him, Rod DeSantis. he, yeah, he's dead in the water. I mean, even I think even Sleepy Joe could run circles around this guy at this point. Like, is this guy autistic? Like, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not even trying to, be rude to autistic people, but this guy just can't. This guy just doesn't have it. Like he can't just have a normal interaction with somebody on the campaign trail. Meanwhile, Trump, despite his age and having been beaten down by, what will be, after all of this, 12 years of straight presidential campaigning. Because look, during his presidency, there was no break from the campaigning. It was just media onslaught after media onslaught. So, the energy on this guy is insane. But I think he needs to come back to Twitter. He needs to become an X poster. That needs to happen sooner rather than later. I think we'd all agree. And Trump needs to maintain that, he's all about loyalty. He holds those grudges. He needs to keep that grudge against some of these Israelis and what they did. He needs to not bring back Jared, no more Javanka, no more of that. Sheldon Adelson's dead. His widow's meeting with Ron DeSantis. You don't need to be taking that money. It's dark MAGA time, it's ultra MAGA. And we're not, Netanyahu's experience, it's total, pro 32nd weeks protests in Israel, things are still going on there, so there's no need to tie your horse to that sinking ship. We can put America first here. And I think again, they're doing everything they can to get Trump out, but it's gonna be another brutal election cycle for, the average American patriot.
Yeah, and look, here on World War Now, we're against this progressive judicial activism that we see both in Russia and in the US, like Judge Antonov, of course, putting Strelkov behind bars and putting all of his supporters away simply for throwing out like offensive words and ways, and Judge Chutkan as well, that I guess the immigrant judge of sorts that's presiding over the Trump trial, and various like just again, it's just offensive to us to view these, I guess. Well, I wouldn't say Trump is exactly the most honest of people, but he does need a fair share. He is one of the only hopes we, I guess, have as people who are somewhat patriotic towards the American state. We do want to see America not descend into this globalist hellhole, or kind of ascend from the hellhole which it's in at the moment, and actually rise up again, not be destroyed by the waves of degeneracy that that's coming forth. And of course, America's participation in the Ukrainian conflict, like we see the Washington Journal actually clearly, Wall Street Journal clearly, somewhat of a Republican piece publishing anti-Ukrainian headlines. So we can see this kind of formulation that, look, if Trump does get a chance to run, there may be this anti-Ukrainian position which arises within the US, right, Conrad? Like, there's a chance that Trump may run on this, well, we have to withdraw aid from Ukraine. We have to stop giving them, these tanks and resources and occasional billions of dollars of aid packages every couple of months. That may be one of the beneficial positions, not just for our Orthodox Church, but for, I guess, the world in general. Like, World War III may be prevented by a Trump presidency. It's not just we're not just speaking about this from a pro-American perspective. The whole world may benefit from this.
Well, Trump claims he can end the conflict in like a week or something. So, if Trump's into Trump, he was really proud of all the North Korea stuff. If he's into that, for his sake of his ego, if he wants to brag that he, ends the conflict, and if he's willing to just accede to like major Russian demands, then that's epic. I'm all for it. I think he'd be willing to do that. Like he'd rather give Russia more than have it drag out and not seem like he's as capable of a negotiator as he may have seemed. And he hasn't made, to me, I think he's made certain promises about what he would have done before the war broke out that are, again, more charitable than the average NATOist, but definitely not what we want to see. And we do know that he started giving weapons to Ukraine, which, to be charitable to Trump there, I think any other president would have probably ramped up the support for Ukraine even earlier than Trump, and he just kind of did whatever was. I mean, look, the military didn't even obey Trump, literally, like openly. There's like I think multiple acts of just blatant treason were committed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Trump's presidency. So I'm sure he was signing on all sorts of things that he probably was barely even properly briefed upon by the military powers that be. So, we're in it for Trump here. We don't want to see him imprisoned. It'll just make his support continue to go up. He's basically already got the nomination in the bag, but the question is it even possible to win the general? Obviously he has the support for it. It's just, is the political path in any way legally, demographically, with all the shenanigans and stuff, the electoral fraud, like, is it even there? And, I'm somewhat pessimistic, but, ever since 2016, it's been a ride. So I think we really have no idea where exactly it's going, but, it'll play into World War III, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's right. I think 2024 is going to be a big year. The Russian election will be on, I believe, the Belarusian election as well as the American elections. In fact, we'll have almost this triumvirate of key elections affecting the status quo of the world situation. And yeah, just in terms of actually participating in that, I think again, me and Conrad, I think we're on the same page. We think Orthodox Christians and just conscientious Christians, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, I think there is something to say in that active political activism, people practically participating in politics. It's still doable, I think, in today's day and age, even with all the fake news and all the electoral fraud that occurs. I think it's still possible for Christians to participate in politics and just try to change things even slightly towards the better. Like even locally, maybe handing out pamphlets or campaigning for maybe a Christian member of Congress or something of that sort. I think that's somewhat still possible in today's particular post 2016. Post 2016 climate. And yeah, I think that's probably where, will we see that next year? Will we see any American Orthodox or Antiochian, whether they be Greek, Antiochian, Serbian bishops actually lining up and supporting any of the local candidates? I'm not sure, but we'll most likely see the Greek Orthodox Church, of course, supporting Joe Biden, or even worse, the Antichrist fake figure of Gavin Newsom. I mean, if we see Archbishop Elpidophoros unfortunately support Gavin Newsom, I think that may be the last nail in this particular unholy coffin, because Gavin Newsom is most likely the scariest candidate. He looks like a worse version of Trudeau, like this fake, artificial Antichrist type figure who simply says what his it's almost like a male version of Kamala Harris, just completely degenerate, supportive of everything evil, and of course he would give everything to the Ukraine, and he would give anything to actually begin World War III and actually light the world on fire for his whichever masters he serves. Gavin Newsom, I think, is the worst case scenario. Even a Ron DeSantis soy president would be better than that.
Well, I mean, Gavin Newsom is as dumb as foolish and as misguided as Kamala Harris, but 40 times as competent. That's the scary part. So he actually is a capable white man who can get things done, and that's why he is like the Trudeau of America, which would be terrible. But yeah, I mean, Elpidophoros, he's a DNC. He lines up with them when it comes to politics. And look, if Trump plays his cards right, I think, and if the persecution in Ukraine continues, and Trump, maybe some good political advisors will tell him to bring that up. Perhaps he could. I mean, who knows if maybe Trump already has the Russian vote in America locked down. But I think if he played his cards right there, I wouldn't be surprised if the Antiochians or certain real core hierarchs would say that well, we don't endorse a candidate. We believe that Mr. Trump would be a better. It's very obvious that he would be better for the situation there. So who knows what could be stated? But I'm not calling for anything. I don't think they need to endorse any candidate or anything. I just think that it would be wise for them to inform the public that there is an aspect to which the church will be directly affected by some of the foreign policy decisions of the U.S., which do come down to these elections, which again, if it wasn't for Trump, I wouldn't even be paying this a second mind because really everyone would have the same perspective on it. But I think there's a chance that Trump could do something for the better in the schism situation. But we're getting good on time here, Dimitri. Unless there's anything you want to tap us into, wrap us off about. I think I'm about ready to wrap this thing up.
Oh, just one very positive story. Just published actually a couple of hours ago. Just saw it about the Metropolitan of Lugansk Pantelimon. So the People's Republic of Lugansk, now Lugansk Oblast. He has officially announced that in the west of Lugansk, so the territory formerly controlled by the Ukrainian forces, some Russian volunteers, Orthodox Christians, discovered an old Soviet bunker from the times of Operation Barbarossa and the Third Reich's invasion of the USSR. And the bunker was actually mined up by Ukrainian booby traps. They, of course, demined it. And what they discovered in the bunker, guess what? The best treasures, right? What do you find in this hidden Soviet bunker? They found 18th, 19th century Orthodox icons. Icons of the Theotokos, the Saint Nicholas of Myra icons. They found icons of Pochayev monastery saints, and just really, really nice icons. There's a couple of very old icons of Saint Nicholas actually, and even old church texts, and I think even some religious objects used in liturgy as well. So it's very interesting that the Ukrainians actually hid all these things in the bunker itself from some of the churches they probably raided since the time of 2014, perhaps, and hid in this bunker. And Metropolitan Pantelimon, these items have been returned to him. So that's really awesome that we have almost like a Russian discovery of a treasure trove amidst all this conflict. And I guess that's a good piece of news to end on, simply because look, even no matter how long this conflict goes on for, there will be positive resolutions to everything, even small ones such as this, where small victories for the Christians in Ukraine, those of the persecuted church. And I guess that's great. Of course, we pray for those affected by Zelensky's government and the current regime there.
Well, that's a good place to end it, I think. Be sure to subscribe, worldwarnow.substack.com. Like I said, the latest Ether Hour will be linked below. Check that out. We appreciate all the subscribers on there. We've gotten some great feedback. We've heard only positive things about the premium content back there, so thank you all so much. Be sure to check us out on Twitter, _. Check us out on Telegram, _Telly. We're on Rumble now. You can check us out. A lot of our videos are slowly but surely getting uploaded there as it syncs to YouTube, so follow us on there, as it'll be a good backup in case some crazy censorship happens. But subscribe on YouTube, of course, World War Now. Let us know in the comments on YouTube and Substack, anyone you'd like us to maybe talk to, shows you'd like us to maybe be appearing on. We're probably going to be appearing on some shows here in the next few weeks and months, so keep us in the loop on things that you want to see, things you want us to talk about, and we always appreciate hearing your comments. But follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri on Twitter at OCanonist. Be sure, again, worldwarnow.substack.com. We've got articles there. Dimitri's article about warrior clerics of the Orthodox Church, that is up there now. Be sure to read it. It's gotten some great feedback as well. The full thing's available to premium subscribers. It's, thousands and thousands of words, so you can't say we're not bringing you all sorts of different mediums of content. But again, we appreciate all of the support. And Dimitri, I'll leave you with the last word.
Yeah, just thank you everybody for listening. Of course, stay in touch with us, give us your feedback, and just look forward to some of the premium content we'll be releasing for our subscribers and supporters on the World War Now Substack. Of course, if anybody wants to hear a particular A4 episode on a certain subject, make sure to reach out to myself or Conrad, or even just send a message to the World War Now page on Twitter, or comment on one of the Substack posts if there's a particular subject matter, because we do have an entire schedule set out for the rest of the year. But if there is a particular subject that you guys would like to hear about, for example, the Old Believers, or somebody wanted to hear about iconography, we could, of course, fit that into the schedule and discuss some of these subjects and maybe bring on some experts on one of the particular fields or topics. So anyway, thank you for your support. We appreciate it. And any fathers of the church listening to us, we ask for your blessings and forgiveness if we made any sort of mistakes or we spoke out of line. We of course appreciate your prayers, as well as the prayers of all Christians listening to this particular episode. So thank you guys for your support.
God bless everybody.